The rain tapped a restless rhythm against the greasy, dust-streaked windows of Hartwell's Bistro on 5th Street, each droplet sliding down like a tear tracing the lines of an old, forgotten face. Mason Hartwell sat alone near the entrance, his head lowered beneath the shadow of a frayed baseball cap, its brim pulled down to hide the gray now creeping through his hair. A pair of cheap drugstore reading glasses perched crookedly on his nose, an unremarkable disguise for a man who had once been the face of a culinary empire. At 62, the man who had graced magazine covers and shaken hands with politicians looked nothing like the image that built his brand. Tonight, Mason wasn't the sharp-suited mogul whose name was synonymous with high-end comfort food. Tonight, he was Martin Hale, an aging consultant with rough, work-worn hands and a backstory about auditing failing restaurants. There was a quiet satisfaction in the irony. This branch was nothing like the glittering flagship in Manhattan that lured in celebrities and critics alike. Wedged between a laundromat and a discount pharmacy in one of the city's forgotten neighborhoods, it bled money with every passing week. The dim lighting did nothing to hide the chipped molding and peeling paint. The air carried a faint, damp musk, the smell of time and neglect. Mason could almost feel the weight of this place's slow decay pressing in on him. His company's marketing had always pushed a simple promise: recipes steeped in authenticity, inspired by family tradition. The jewel in the crown, the dish that had made him a household name, was the rosemary chicken tagliatelle. Critics had called it transcendent, claiming it was the kind of meal that lingered in memory for years. Customers had once lined up in the rain to taste it, charmed by the story of Mason perfecting the recipe in his grandmother's kitchen. But Mason knew the truth. That charming backstory had been a fabrication, a lie polished so often he'd almost come to believe it himself. "Table for one." The voice pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up to see a young woman, early 20s, dark hair pulled into a neat ponytail, amber eyes that seemed older than her years. Her uniform was spotless despite the restaurant's worn surroundings, and she moved with the quiet precision of someone who'd learned to survive in tight spaces without making a sound. "Yes, please," Mason replied, lowering his voice and adding the faint rasp he'd practiced for weeks. "Somewhere quiet, if possible." She led him to a booth in the far corner. The vinyl seat was cracked but scrubbed clean. Dim light pooled over the table, perfect for a man who wanted to disappear. As she handed him a menu, he noticed her name tag, Aaliyah. The sound of it sent an unexpected chill down his spine, one that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. "Can I start you with something to drink?" she asked, pulling a small, weathered notepad from her apron. "Coffee, black," Mason said, though his throat felt suddenly dry. "And I think I already know what I want to eat." Her pen hovered over the page. "Quick decision maker. I like that." "The rosemary chicken tagliatelle," he said slowly. The words scraped his tongue like sandpaper. "I've heard it's your signature dish." Something flickered across her face, so quick he might have missed it if he weren't watching. Her fingers tightened on the pen. For a fraction of a second, her professional smile wavered. "It is," she said finally, her voice steady but faintly guarded. "Been on the menu since the beginning." "Or so they say." Mason nodded, pretending casual interest even as his heart thudded hard against his ribs. "Family recipe?" he asked, testing the waters. "Something like that." Her tone was light, but there was an edge there, something sharp beneath the surface. "I'll put that order in for you, Mr. Hale." She glanced at him briefly before writing his alias on her pad and walking toward the kitchen, her steps calm but strangely deliberate. Mason watched her pause at the service window, leaning in to speak quietly to the cook, an older man with skin like worn leather, his chef's hat tilted slightly askew. They exchanged a look Mason couldn't read. The coffee came first, delivered by a teenage busboy who seemed to wish he were anywhere else. Mason wrapped his hands around the chipped ceramic mug, letting the heat seep into his fingers. From the corner of his eye, he could see Aaliyah moving behind the kitchen pass, focused and efficient. but her gaze kept flicking back toward him when she thought he wasn't looking. 20 minutes later, she returned with a plate in her hands. The steam curled upward, carrying the rich perfume of rosemary, garlic, and cream. The chicken was sliced and fanned neatly over the fresh pasta, each strand draped in a sauce so smooth it gleamed. A scattering of herbs crowned the dish like a signature flourish. It looked exactly the way he remembered it. Yet, as Aliyah set the plate before him, he saw her hands tremble, just barely. Her eyes lingered on the dish, and her expression shifted, something between reverence and grief, with a shadow of anger threading through it. "This dish," she murmured, so softly he had to lean forward to hear, "was stolen from my mom." The words landed like a punch to the gut. His fork slipped from his fingers, clattering against the plate. The ambient noise of the restaurant, clinking glasses, low conversation, the hiss of the grill, seemed to fade, leaving only the echo of her voice. Mason's eyes met hers, and something inside him froze. It wasn't recognition. Not exactly. She was too young for that. But there was something in her gaze, a strange, unshakable familiarity, a trace of something shared, an echo of bloodlines and broken promises. "I'm sorry," Aliyah said quickly, her mask snapping back into place. "That was inappropriate. Please, enjoy your meal." She turned to leave. "Wait." The word came out harsher than he meant, his voice rough and tight. "What did you say about your mother?" Aliyah stopped, glancing around the nearly empty dining room. The other servers were busy, the kitchen staff absorbed in their work. Her hand tightened around the edge of her notepad, as if weighing whether she should speak at all. Aliyah's eyes flickered away, her voice light, but hiding something deeper. "Nothing," she said, almost too quickly. "Just, sometimes I think I recognize certain flavors. Tastes from when I was little." She gave a small shrug, as if trying to wave it off. "It's silly." But it wasn't silly, and they both knew it. Mason's gaze drifted back to the plate in front of him, the same rosemary chicken tagliatelle that had built his fortune, that had made him the darling of critics and investors alike. And yet, to him, it was more than food. It was a stolen legacy. A recipe taken from a young woman named Yasmin Rivera 23 years ago. A woman who had once trusted him with her heart, her dreams, and her family's secrets. A woman who had died believing her name and her heritage had been erased. His fingers trembled as he reached for his fork, but the weight of guilt pressed against his chest until breathing itself felt like an effort. He glanced at Aliyah again, really looked at her this time. The subtle tilt of her chin, the way she paused before speaking, the almost invisible scar above her left eyebrow. He remembered that scar. He had kissed it once, when she was just a toddler crying in her mother's arms after tumbling from a playground swing. Aliyah. The name slipped out like a confession, both a prayer and a curse. She had been barely old enough to form words when he signed the papers that erased her mother from his company's history. Barely a child when he chose profit over love, when he let lawyers convince him that Yasmin's undocumented status made her a risk rather than the partner she truly was. And now, all these years later, she stood before him, serving him the dish her mother had created, on the very bones of her mother's dream. The fork slipped from his hand, striking the plate with a sharp clatter that seemed to echo in the dimly lit room. Aliyah's brow furrowed with concern. "Sir, are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." He shut his eyes, and in that instant, Yasmin was there. Not in the flesh, but so vividly in his mind it hurt. Her laughter filling a tiny apartment kitchen, her hands stirring a pot of sauce while explaining how her grandmother taught her to build flavors like a melody. And beside her, a chubby toddler in a high chair, babbling happily, her mother's eyes wide with trust. When Mason opened his eyes, the present returned like a cold wave. Aliyah stood there, still watching him, carrying her mother's gaze in a face that mirrored the past too perfectly. "Yes," he murmured, his voice catching. "I think I have." He forced himself to lift the fork and take a bite. The second the flavors touched his tongue, time folded in on itself. He was no longer a weathered man in a dying restaurant. He was 28 again, sitting cross-legged on Yasmin's kitchen floor in Queens. The rosemary was perfectly balanced, the chicken's golden crust exactly as she had taught him. Pat the meat dry, heat the pan until it almost smoked, then sear it without fear. The cream sauce carried that faint hint of white wine and the barely there warmth of nutmeg. Small, deliberate choices Yasmin had shared in whispered tones, as if they were precious family secrets. "You have to taste as you go," her voice murmured from memory, lilting with the soft accent she'd never lost. "Food is like love, Mason. You can't just follow steps, you have to feel it." He could see her then, moving gracefully between stove and counter, never missing a beat even as she reached over to wipe sauce from baby Alia's cheeks. Yasmin would tell him about her grandmother in Guadalajara, how she taught her to make beauty out of scarcity, to transform the simplest ingredients into something worthy of celebration. "Mia Bella used to say food was love made edible," she told him one night, her dark eyes glowing with sincerity. "Even when we had nothing, no money, no papers, no hope, we had this." The weight of memory pressed hard against Mason's chest. He set the fork down, his appetite gone. And then came the darker memory, the one he had spent 2 decades trying to bury. That day in his office, the conference table littered with contracts, Yasmin's expression shifting from confusion to horror as the lawyers explained how her legal status complicated the business. He had sat silent, letting their words strip her of her rights, her pride, her history. When she whispered that the recipes were her family's, her grandmother's, her mother's, the attorney dismissed it as a generous contribution to his company. When Mason finally spoke, it was not in her defense. "It's just business," he told her. "You'll be compensated." She had stared at him then with tears shining in her eyes. "I thought you loved me." "I do," he'd said, knowing it was a lie, even as it left his lips. "No," she had replied, shaking her head with quiet devastation. "You love what I could give you. That's not the same thing." And she had walked away, baby Alia clinging to her shoulder, never looking back. Now, 23 years later, Mason sat before her daughter, unable to lift another bite. The cream sauce was cooling, forming a thin skin over the surface like an old wound refusing to heal. "Excuse me," Mr. Hale Alia's voice broke into his thoughts. She was back at his table, concern in her eyes. "You haven't touched your food. Is something wrong?" He met her gaze, searching for the right words, words that would not betray the truth he'd kept buried. "No, it's perfect," he said finally. "Actually, I was wondering, where did you say this recipe came from?" Alia glanced toward the emptying dining room, then slid into the booth across from him. The move was bold, but the dinner rush had ended and no one seemed to care. "My mom," she said simply. "She died when I was 7, but I still remember her cooking. She used to make this dish when we had nothing. Said it was her grandmother's recipe from Mexico, passed down through 3 generations. Mason felt his pulse slow, his body heavy with dread. "What was your mother's name?" he asked, though he already knew. "Yasmin Rivera." Her voice softened with affection. "She always told me food was love made edible, that even when we were poor, we could still create something beautiful." The exact words. Mason's chest constricted as if someone were tightening a vice around his heart. "She sounds like she was an amazing woman," he said quietly. She was. Alia's fingers traced invisible patterns on the tabletop. "She used to talk about a man she loved once." Alia's voice softened, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "She said there was a man once, someone she loved. He promised her they'd open a restaurant together, that they'd build something incredible, but one day he was just gone, and she never got over it." Mason felt the blood drain from his face. His pulse thundered in his ears. Did she ever say what happened to him?" Alia's eyes hardened, the warmth replaced with a quiet steel. She said he chose money over love, that when things got difficult, he threw her away like garbage. The words struck like body blows. Mason's grip tightened around the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. She died thinking her recipes meant nothing, Aaliyah continued, her voice trembling now, though her gaze never wavered. She thought her legacy would disappear with her. But I'm not going to let that happen. I'm studying culinary arts at night, saving every dollar I can. One day, I'll have a food truck, maybe even a restaurant, and my mom's recipes will live again. Mason stared at her, this young woman who carried not only Yasmin's eyes but her spirit, her resilience, her dreams. And in that moment, something inside him cracked wide open. 23 years of guilt bore down on him, not as an abstract weight, but as a living, breathing truth sitting across the table from him. Sometimes, he said carefully, choosing each word like it might shatter in his mouth, justice takes time, but it comes. Aaliyah tilted her head slightly, studying him with those amber eyes that felt like they could see straight through him. That's an odd thing for a restaurant consultant to say. Mason left Hartwell's bistro that night with his thoughts tangled and heavy. He didn't sleep. Instead, he lay awake in his hotel room, her words repeating in his mind like a looped recording. By dawn, the decision was made. He didn't know if it would save his soul or destroy everything he had built, but he couldn't turn away anymore. By 11 that night, the restaurant was dark, long since emptied of its last customer. Mason found the spare key exactly where he expected, tucked under a fake rock beside the dumpster. It was an oversight he'd meant to fix years ago, but tonight, it was his passage in. The bistro felt different in the silence. The shadows stretched long over the tabletops, reaching toward him like accusing fingers. The air smelled of old grease and something older still, memories he'd tried to bury. He moved quietly through the kitchen and into the cramped back office, his phone's flashlight cutting thin slices of light through the dark. The space smelled of stale coffee and desperation. Paperwork lay scattered across a metal desk whose edges were worn smooth by decades of elbows and worry. He started searching. The cabinets were stuffed with invoices, employee schedules, supplier receipts. Nothing unusual for a failing restaurant. But in the bottom drawer of the second cabinet, tucked behind a pile of yellowing tax returns, his fingers found it. A manila folder, soft with age, marked in block letters. Original menus, 1995 to 2002. His breath caught as he opened it. Inside were photocopies of handwritten menu drafts, edges stained with wine and warped from water damage. But it wasn't the stains that froze him. It was the handwriting. The looping Y's, the circles over the is, the slight rightward tilt from years of hurried note-taking. Yasmin's handwriting. He traced one faded recipe with his fingertip, rosemary chicken tagliatelle. Her words spilled across the page in careful detail. Fresh pasta, herb-crusted chicken, white wine cream sauce, rosemary, garlic, a whisper of nutmeg. She had even written the cost per serving and suggested price. Below it, in smaller script, was a note that made his throat tighten. Abuela's recipe, modified for American tastes. Remember to taste for seasoning. Cada familia tiene su toque especial. Every family has their special touch. There were others, dozens of them. 3-cheese lasagna, herb-crusted salmon, chocolate torte. Recipes that had built his empire, all in her handwriting. At the very bottom was something that nearly buckled his knees. A business plan, handwritten on lined notebook paper. The title read, Rivera Hartwell Bistro, a partnership proposal. Her mission statement filled the first page in that same neat script, to bring authentic family recipes to American diners while honoring the traditions and stories behind each dish. We believe food is love made edible, and every meal should tell a story of heritage, family, and hope. She had outlined every dream they once shared. Multiple locations, cooking classes, a cookbook celebrating immigrant family recipes. And at the bottom, both their names appeared side by side in fading ink. Yasmin Rivera, head chef and recipe developer, and Mason Hartwell, business manager and partner. Equal partners. Mason sank into the creaky chair, clutching the papers like a lifeline. For years he had told himself he had no choice, that the lawyers were right, that the partnership was impossible. But here, in his hands, was proof that she had been so much more than the girlfriend who gave him recipes. She had been his equal, the architect of everything. A sound from the kitchen pulled him from his thoughts. Soft footsteps. A beam of light sweeping across the floor. Mason switched off his phone's flashlight and slid the folder shut, plunging the office into darkness. The footsteps drew closer, along with a voice humming a lullaby. Spanish, soft and warm. The same lullaby Yasmin used to sing to baby Aliyah as she cooked. The office door eased open, and there she was, Aliyah. Her face bathed in the glow of her phone's flashlight. She didn't look startled to see him. Only certain. "I figured you'd come back," she said quietly, stepping inside. "You've been asking too many questions about my mother for someone who's supposed to be auditing the books." Mason's throat felt dry as sand. "I was just looking for evidence," she finished for him. She slid into the chair opposite, the beam of her flashlight casting shifting shadows across the walls. "I've been doing some digging of my own. Mr. Hale." She let the pause linger. "Or should I say, Mr. Hartwell?" The name landed between them like a blade. "I work in this kitchen every day," she said, her voice calm but her eyes fierce. "Do you know what the line cooks say about the founder? They say Mason Hartwell never cooked a day in his life, that he built his empire on stolen recipes from a woman named Yasmin Rivera." Mason's pulse pounded in his ears. "Aliyah. They say she was young, undocumented, in love with the wrong man. They say he took everything from her and left her with nothing." Her voice trembled just slightly, but she didn't stop. "They say she died broke, heartbroken, believing her family's recipes would be forgotten." The folder of original menus sat on the desk between them like damning evidence laid out before a jury. Mason's gaze lingered on it, feeling the weight of every page, each one a nail in the coffin of the story he'd told himself for 23 years. Aliyah leaned forward, her voice sharp but measured. "What I don't understand," she said slowly, "is why a successful CEO would come to this failing restaurant, pretending to be someone else. Why ask so many questions about a dead woman's recipes?" Mason met her stare, those same amber eyes that had once looked at him from Yasmin's face, and saw in them 2 decades of unspoken pain. The moment of reckoning had come. There was no place left to hide. "Because," he said quietly, his voice breaking on the word, "I'm the man who destroyed your mother's life." Silence flooded the cramped office, heavy and suffocating. The beam from Aliyah's flashlight wavered slightly in her hand, scattering shadows across the walls. Mason braced himself for yelling, for rage, for her to hurl the folder in his face. But instead, she laughed. A sharp, hollow sound that cut deeper than any outburst could. It was the same laugh Yasmin had given him when she signed the papers all those years ago. The laugh of a woman whose worst fears had been proven true. "You know what's funny?" Aliyah said, her voice steady even as tears welled in her eyes. "I used to imagine meeting you. I thought I'd confront you, demand answers, maybe make you pay for what you did. But looking at you now," she shook her head slowly, "you're just a sad old man who's been lying to himself for so long. He probably believes the lie." Her words landed like blows because they were true. For decades, Mason had told himself he was a victim of circumstance, that the lawyers had forced his hand, that the law had left him no choice. But looking at Aliyah, so young, so fierce, so much like her mother, he knew those excuses had been nothing more than cowardice. "Your mother was the most talented chef I ever met," he said, the words raw in his throat. "She could take $5 worth of ingredients and make something that could make a grown man cry. I was just a business school dropout with big dreams and no talent." "So you stole hers," Aaliyah replied flatly. "I fell in love with her," Mason said before he could stop himself. "Not just with her food. With her. With the way she hummed while she worked. The way she made our tiny apartment feel like home. The way she looked at the world like it was still full of possibility." A flicker of softness crossed Aaliyah's face, but it was gone as quickly as it came. Then why betray her? Mason ran both hands through his graying hair, his voice low and thick. "Because I was a coward. Because when the lawyers told me her immigration status could destroy everything we'd built, I chose the safe path. I chose money over love, security over loyalty." "You chose yourself over her," Aaliyah said. "Yes." The admission came out in a whisper. "I told myself I was protecting our future, but the truth is, I was just protecting me." For a long moment, Aaliyah said nothing. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight far too heavy for someone her age. "Do you know how she died?" Mason swallowed hard. "I heard it was cancer." "Cervical cancer," she said, her tone sharp as a scalpel. "The kind that's treatable if caught early, but she couldn't afford regular doctor visits after you cut her loose. No insurance, no money, no hope. She worked 3 jobs just to keep us fed. By the time she saw a doctor, it was too late." The guilt that had lived inside Mason for years erupted, choking him. His shoulders shook as he covered his face with his hands. "She still talked about you," Aaliyah said softly, "even when she could barely speak. She told me you weren't evil, just weak. That weakness is the cruelest kind of evil, because it hides behind good intentions." Mason looked at her through tear-blurred eyes. "What else did she say?" "That she forgave you," Aaliyah replied. "Not because you deserved it, but because hatred was too heavy a thing to carry while you're dying." They sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, the air between them thick with grief and truths too long unspoken. Finally, Aaliyah reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. "I found this online," she said. On the screen was a photo from a corporate gala in 1995. Mason, younger and brimming with arrogance, holding an award. But in the background, almost hidden, was Yasmin in the blue dress Mason had bought her. She was smiling, proud, watching him take credit for work that was as much hers as his. "She was there," Aaliyah said, "supporting you, even after you'd already started cutting her out. But the caption doesn't mention her name. She's just another face in the crowd." Mason stared at the image, remembering how that night he'd barely acknowledged her, too busy chasing investors to notice the woman who had built his dreams standing behind him. "I loved her," he said, almost to himself. "No," Aaliyah said firmly. "You loved what she could do for you. You loved how she made you feel, but you didn't love her enough to fight for her." She stood, tucking her phone away. "I have to get home. Class in the morning." "Wait," Mason called out. "What happens now?" She paused at the doorway. "I don't know. I've wondered about you for 23 years. Now that I have my answers." She met his gaze, her voice cutting like glass. "I wish I didn't." "Aaliyah, please." She stopped him with a final echo of his own words. Sometimes justice takes time, but it comes. And then she was gone. 3 days passed. Mason came back each evening, sitting in the same booth, ordering the same dish. Aaliyah served him politely, but never met his eyes. The unspoken truth hung between them like a blade waiting to drop. He barely touched his food. How could he? Every bite tasted like betrayal. On Thursday, the bistro buzzed with more customers than usual. Food bloggers snapping pictures, posting captions about an undiscovered neighborhood gem. The irony made Mason's chest ache. Aaliyah worked the floor with practiced grace, though he noticed the tension in her shoulders and the way she kept glancing toward the kitchen, where Jerome, the grizzled line cook, manned the grill. He'd caught whispers between them earlier in the week. Words like original menus, business plan, and equal partners had reached his ears like distant thunder. At the peak of the dinner rush, Mason noticed Aaliyah heading toward him. This time, she wasn't alone. Jerome was beside her, along with 2 other servers. They formed a half circle around his table, and the room seemed to still. "Ladies and gentlemen," Aaliyah said, her voice clear and unwavering, "I'd like to introduce someone special who's been dining with us this week." A ripple of curiosity moved through the room. Phones were raised, cameras recording. "This is Martin Hale," she continued. "At least that's what he's been calling himself." Mason started to stand, but Jerome placed a firm hand on the table, his voice low. "I think you should stay put, boss." The word boss hit the air like a gunshot. Aaliyah held up her phone, the photo from the gala glowing on the screen. "This is actually Mason Hartwell, founder and CEO of Hartwell's Bistro." A collective murmur spread through the crowd. "He's been coming here pretending to be a consultant," Aaliyah said, her eyes never leaving his. "But the truth is, he's been eating food stolen from my mother 23 years ago." Aaliyah held the yellowed sheet aloft, the aged paper trembling slightly in her hand, but her voice unwavering. "This," she announced, "is the original recipe for our rosemary chicken tagliatelle, written in my mother's own handwriting, Yasmin Rivera. A name you won't find anywhere in your corporate history." Mr. Hartwell Mason felt the air tighten around him, the walls pressing in. Every head in the restaurant had turned toward him, expressions shifting from curiosity to outrage as the truth began to take shape. "My mother was only 25 when she trusted you," Aaliyah continued, her voice gaining strength like a rising tide. "She was undocumented, vulnerable, and in love. She gave you her family's recipes passed down through 3 generations, because she believed you were her partner." Jerome stepped forward, his voice gravelly, each word weighted by decades of hard labor in hot kitchens. "I knew Yasmin back then, sweetest girl you'd ever meet, and she could cook like nobody's business. She used to tell me about her boyfriend, Mason. How you 2 were going to open restaurants together, how you promised to take care of her and her baby girl." The room had fallen utterly silent, except for the soft hum of phones recording every word. "But when lawyers told him my mother's immigration status was a liability," Aaliyah pressed on, her eyes locked on Mason, "he chose his business over her life. He took her recipes, erased her from the partnership, and left her with nothing." Mason's voice scraped out of him, barely more than a whisper. "Aaliyah, please." "She died believing her legacy meant nothing," Aaliyah said, her voice breaking now, tears running freely down her cheeks. "Cervical cancer, the kind that could have been treated early if she'd had insurance, if she hadn't been working 3 jobs just to keep us alive after you abandoned her." A woman at a nearby table gasped, a sharp intake of breath that cut through the heavy air. One of the food bloggers was typing so furiously his phone screen glowed like firelight. "But here's the thing." Mr. Hartwell Aaliyah wiped her tears with the back of her hand, squaring her shoulders. "Her legacy didn't die with her. I'm still here. Her recipes are still here, and now everyone knows the truth." She turned toward the packed dining room. "Every bite of rosemary chicken tagliatelle you've ever eaten at a Hartwell's Bistro came from Yasmin Rivera. The 3-cheese lasagna, Heron the herb-crusted salmon, Heron the chocolate torte, Heron. All of it came from a young Mexican woman who believed food was love made edible." Mason rose unsteadily to his feet, shame burning through him like fever. I loved her. I made mistakes." "You made choices," Jerome cut in, his voice like a blade slicing through the air. "And now it's time to face the consequences." The room erupted in low, furious whispers. Mason caught fragments. "Call the news. Post this everywhere. Can you believe he's been eating here?" As the sea of faces blurred into a wall of condemnation. Aaliyah stepped close enough that only he could hear her next words. "You said you loved her, but you were a coward. At least now everyone knows which part was true." Mason stumbled toward the exit, each step heavier than the last. Phones followed his retreat, the soft clicks of photos and quiet hum of recording sealing his humiliation. Her voice rang out behind him, clear and resolute. And finally, her name will be remembered. By morning, number Yasmin Rivera was trending across social media. The video had gone viral overnight. News anchors dissected it on morning shows. His board of directors demanded crisis meetings. Lawyers whispered about damage control. Mason ignored them all. He sat in his penthouse office, staring at a photograph he had kept hidden for 23 years. Yasmin in her tiny kitchen, flour dusting her dark hair, baby Aaliyah on her hip. She was laughing, radiant, back when the future had seemed limitless. 3 weeks later, Mason stood outside the 5th Street Bistro. This time there was no disguise. The media frenzy had ebbed, though photographers still lingered, hoping for a shot of the disgraced CEO now held up as the emblem of corporate greed and stolen culture. The restaurant had been reborn. The dim, peeling interior had given way to warm lighting, fresh paint, and walls lined with photographs. Not of Mason, but of immigrant families cooking together, of recipes handwritten in different languages, of heritage preserved. And at the center of it all, mounted proudly behind the host's stand, was a large portrait of Yasmin Rivera, smiling, holding her baby girl. A brass plaque beneath it read, Yasmin Rivera, 1970 to 2002, founder, recipe creator, mother. Food is love made edible. Inside, the dining room pulsed with life. Families laughed, critics scribbled notes, and neighbors shared plates the way people share stories. Aaliyah emerged from the kitchen in a crisp, white chef's coat embroidered with her name. Chef Rivera, executive chef and owner. She spotted Mason immediately, her face unreadable. The room quieted as eyes followed her approach. "Mr. Hartwell," she said evenly. "Aaliyah." He gestured to the transformed space. "It's beautiful. Your mother would be proud." "I hope so." She glanced at the portrait, then back at him. "Why are you here?" Mason reached into his jacket, pulling out a thick stack of documents. Ownership transfer papers. "This restaurant, and 3 more like it, are yours, free and clear." Her eyes widened. "I don't want your charity." "It's not charity, it's justice," Mason said, holding her gaze. 23 years too late, but justice all the same. He went on. "I've also created the Yasmin Rivera Foundation for minority women in the culinary arts. Scholarships, business loans, mentorship programs, funded entirely by the profits your mother's recipes earned over the years." Aaliyah studied him for a long moment. "And what do you get out of this? Redemption? Forgiveness? I don't deserve either. I'm doing it because it's right, and because your mother deserved to have her name on everything she created." Finally, she accepted the papers. "The signature dish?" Mason asked quietly, nodding toward the new menus. "What's it called now?" A smile touched her lips, the first real one he'd seen from her. "Yasmin's Legacy Pasta. The menu tells the story. How my grandmother taught it to my mother, how my mother made it her own. No more stolen history." The tightness in Mason's chest eased for the first time in decades. Around them, the restaurant thrummed with life, laughter, and the clink of dishes, a living testament to the legacy Yasmin had left behind. "There's one more thing," Aaliyah said, producing a worn photograph from her apron. It was the same one Mason had been staring at for weeks. Yasmin in her kitchen, baby Aaliyah reaching for the camera. "I kept this since I was 18, she said. "My mother forgave you before she died. It's taken me longer. But I'm choosing to forgive you too. Not because you deserve it, because I refuse to spend my life carrying the anger that almost consumed her." Mason's eyes filled. "Don't thank me yet," she added, her tone softening. "You're going to eat here tonight, in that corner booth where this all began. You're going to taste Yasmin's Legacy Pasta the way it was meant to be served. With love, with respect, with her name on it for all to see." He took his seat, watching her return to the kitchen. Through the service window, she moved with a quiet grace so achingly familiar. When the pasta arrived, steaming and fragrant, Mason took a bite, and for the first time in 23 years, tasted not guilt, but hope. Across the room, Yasmin's portrait seemed to smile, her name, her story, her recipes, honored, remembered, and finally, celebrated.